This is our very, very last panel. We really wanted to give a moment to talk. There's a lot in 5 years that have happened, a lot of things to reflect on, a lot of things we need to keep moving forward and accelerate. So Nikki does have a mic, just in case. I'm putting that out there. I'm putting her on the spot so everybody knows she can answer questions. But I'm going to let Wes start while I walk over there.
All right, yeah, so yes, this is a chance for us to get some feedback. Y'all who have been here before, you've seen some of our podcasty feeling stuff that we do to kind of close out. But we wanted to get a chance for you all to ask questions. Let me look at the title of this too, right? It was Answering Questions to Accelerate Progress. So we're not expecting the panel to have all of the answers. We're expecting them actually to keep raising them so that the NASA folks like Nikki and others who are here can hear those questions and what we need answered so we can get actionable steps going. And I'll just go ahead and introduce our panelists, and then we'll have each one of them give their hot take. And I've asked them to calibrate their Scoville scale appropriately, so it's Tabasco, not ghost pepper.
Ghost pepper all
Ghost pepper
day.
all the time. Okay. So you know me, you know Jamie. Next to Jamie, we have Tim Cichan. Maybe I've got it wrong. I probably do.
That's
All right,
right.
great.
Thank you.
Tim's the space exploration architect at Lockheed Martin. Next to him, we have Dr. Glenn Lightsey, who's a John W. Endowed Chair Professor at Georgia Tech, and he's also going to be our gracious host in the fall. So looking forward to going to their wonderful place. Then next to him, we have Tim number 2, Timothy Mounsey, who's Director of Business Development at Lunar Outpost, and you've seen some of the wonderful stuff that they've got going on. And all the way at the end, last but not least, batting cleanup, I guess, maybe not quite, is Dr. MacDonald, who's Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and former Chief Economist for NASA. So bringing that perspective into this as well. So now that we've gone through, that's given you just a minute to warm things up, get your heat ready. Tim, you want to start us off with your hot take?
Sure. And I don't know if I've achieved Tabasco. Maybe it's lukewarm. But I think we all agree that we want infrastructure on the moon. And I think that is a key objective for LSIC, for STMD. And so I want to emphasize that very fundamental point, is that's what we're here to do. And I understand the challenge, and I understand all the budget questions and all of those sorts of things. But really getting to flight and getting to the surface is what we all want. And we've now had 4 CLIPS launches with varying levels of success, from fully successful to not so much. And so we've got a pipeline of transportation going. And so on every one of those missions, I would love to see, regardless of the scale, that we are starting to build up infrastructure on the moon, and that we are focusing on those things we need to focus on very early. And I think that's what this community is here to do. And I think that in doing it in a different way, with more rapid and more frequent launches, I think that's great. The other thing that I'll bring up, since I have a moment, is the international perspective. And I think that we are all wanting to go to the moon across the world. The whole world is interested, and the whole world is, in some ways, looking to the United States to lead the way. But they want to be active participants. And we know that interoperability on the moon across the world is going to be quite the problem. So I'm a member of GEGSLA, a global expert group on sustainable lunar activity, and in particular the co-chair, along with Marcel, of Working Group 2 on interoperability. And so we're having a webinar and virtual workshop coming up on June 19th. And we specifically wanted this workshop to be co-sponsored across GEGSLA, LSIC, and Logic. So thank you both, and for Logic for coordinating with us. The support has been amazing. And so we'll have a video message from the director of the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs. We'll have a panel of speakers, of international speakers, on interoperability. But then the real point is to go into a virtual workshop and talk about one of the first problems that we think we have is, who's going to the moon, and what are they doing? And we decided that was the problem first in interoperability, because when we talk interoperability, we want to be talking to the folks who are going to the moon and have needs for interoperability. So we want to talk about a database, maybe one that's just a little bit more up to date because it's so hard than the LSIC webpage, because you guys know more than ever, it's almost impossible, right? And the UN has a database, but folks don't put it in until after they've launched, and that's not good enough. So anyway, join us at the workshop. On June 19th, there's a QR code to register, and I'm sure there'll be more advertisements. We want to get the whole world engaged in that virtual workshop.
Thanks, Tim. And I mean, that gets at one of the questions that I think happened earlier that didn't get asked, which is how are we coordinating on these things? You know, we coordinate on stuff like this. So
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, hi, everybody. So I'm here kind of representing academia, and maybe my take's going to be a little hotter. So first of all, I feel like the American model for research, which has been incredibly successful for over 100 years, is a three-legged model. It's a model based on government, industry, and academia, and every part of that economy has a role to play. And that model is under threat. I mean, at least some of those legs, we don't know what's going to happen. And so I think we have to think about how do we protect this model of engaging in research that is really created the world that we live in. And you know, there are things we can control and things we can't control. So we can't control everything. But one thing I think we need to think about is how things are changing, because you know, stability is always kind of an illusion. The idea that everything will stay the same, that it is the way it was yesterday, that doesn't really exist. That's just a perception. So one thing that has changed, I think, is, you know, we see so much more commercial investment in space. And you know, a lot at LEO, but you know, we can extend that to the moon. And I think one thing that needs to change is the way universities do research. And one of the ways that universities can change the way they do research is they can engage more with the commercial sector. And so really what I want to see is more streamlined engagement between academia and industry. And historically, I think people feel, well, maybe that's government's role, but I don't, you know, number one, we don't know what's going to happen with the government. Number two, with all the investments that we're seeing in commercial space, I don't think we need to rely 100% on the government anymore. So one of the things we really need to focus on is streamlining the process for commercial engagement with university. And one of the big elephants in the room is intellectual property. And I really think we need to find more favorable terms for companies to commercialize intellectual property that is developed at universities. You know, universities have a philanthropic mission. Their mission really is to benefit society, and it isn't about making a profit. So I don't think there's really any conflict between a university developing technology that then gets commercialized by a company for profit. That's perfectly fine. I mean, society benefits. So I really think, you know, as we look to lunar science, and that's the other thing I want to say, is through all of this process, we don't want to lose science, right? I mean, we're facing these big budget cuts in science. But, you know, we can do science with commercial initiatives. You know, commercial missions can have payloads that have scientific applications. They can also be dual use. You know, why not think about all the things you could learn from a radiation dosimeter, right? I mean, it has tremendous benefit for the science community, but it also is something a commercial industry provider would be very interested in for like the survival of their hardware or improving their missions for the future. So, you know, I think we need to have these dual use engagements where we can really let science continue and thrive through the commercial sector as well as through just government funding. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Maybe we're moving up like a hot wing style. I don't know if anybody's seen that, where it gets spicier as we go along.
Yeah, I'll touch on, I think, I want to kind of beat over the head what was discussed in the last panel, which is we need actual mechanisms for funding demand signals. You know, no longer is this a market that's sort of a we're satisfying the needs of one customer, which is NASA. Obviously, with some potential budget restrictions or budget cutbacks, there are other organizations in the DoD internationally from a space agency perspective, from a commercial perspective, that have priorities and are trying to push those forward. And, I think about mechanisms like what the Texas state government did with the Texas Space Commission, creating this SURF grant. I think it was $150 million of funding for different projects that were going to enable that state to foster innovation and local capacity and capability for their state space industry. And why can't we mirror that on an international level, right? Why can't it be maybe led by the US and NASA, DoD agencies, commercial, to define what those regulations are, define what the rules of engagement are, and then allow international organizations and agencies to fund, to put their money where their mouth is, to actually fund those initiatives and create this pool of capital that maybe is broad, that allows a number of different solutions to respond and get funding, which creates a demand signal for private capital to ultimately fund those initiatives or maybe match funding. But ultimately, I think we're not necessarily talking about the mechanisms. And there's examples of, from a national security perspective, there's an example like AUKUS, which is a trilateral security agreement between Australia, the US, and the UK to enhance military capabilities. I think also DARPA LASSO, which is this active solicitation right now, is a great example of agencies working together. It's a DARPA program, but NASA's involved, USGS is involved in different ways, and obviously soliciting commercial solutions for capabilities in low lunar orbit and to map water ice on the moon. So I think we need to look at what's already been done from a national security sort of collaboration perspective, from a intergovernment agency perspective, and try to replicate that on an international scale to create the demand signals for private capital to really be confident in returns on their investment.
I really like that, because we didn't touch on international as much in the last panel. So that's great tie into that. Thanks for that.
All right, Alex, you have the
You're at the end, so
the distinction,
All right.
full hot.
obligation.
Well, it's interesting times. I always enjoy this meeting because this is a group of people who really think about how we're going to be developing whatever we develop on the lunar surface. And we're at the beginning, obviously, of a new administration. And as the opening lines of Dune reminds us, I mean the David Lynch Dune, the OG, a beginning is a very delicate time. And so we're going to be going through a process of discussing, what is the new policy for the future of the lunar surface. We have some early signals in the sand, which, I think give us a lot to think about. The President's budget request, at least from the skinny budget, is the largest single budget reduction that NASA has ever seen. A total budget reduction of $6 billion proposed. We'll see what Congress does. We'll see how that all proceeds, but it's a pretty big shift. When I served in the Office of Administrator in the first Trump administration, every year the Trump administration was trying to ask for more money. So there's a shift there. In addition, the skinny budget includes information related to prioritizing missions to Mars. So in a world where you have a reduced top line at a very significant level, now you have this potential new out-year lean of implied funding for a very complicated and expensive mission of sending humans to Mars. So what is that all going to mean for lunar surface, right? I mean, that's obviously the question. We don't have crystal balls. But I think one of the things that we can see coming, and I think this is one of the subjects that this community will be heavily engaged in, is what I've come to kind of think of as the debate between the lunar minimalists and the lunar maximalists. And the lunar minimalists are kind of folks who say, well, all we need to do is land. We'll see whether or not there's a business case. Maybe we'll bring some rocks back. Obviously, we'll make that geopolitical signal. But we don't need really to commit to lunar surface architecture because we might want to keep our options open for the future. We need to land. We'll figure out after that. And then, of course, the lunar maximalist community says, no, we must immediately commit to a full industrialized city on the moon tomorrow. And I've obviously painted kind of two straw men there, but those kind of represent, I think, some of the trends that we see. And I think one of the opportunities before us is to really kind of target a practical, reality-based approach, suggestion for policy related to the lunar surface. I love the line of, one of many customers, NASA, one of many customers. Used it many times myself when I was the agency. However, when one of the customers is 98% of your revenue, then there's some quotes around that line. And that's still where we are. There's investment that's coming in, but a lot of that is hoping to get some of that future revenue. And right now, we're not seeing a lot of new sources of revenue, right? Even we talk about the DARPA one, okay, I don't know, 50 million a year. Okay, we're still in that same percentage ratio, right? So I think we need to recognize that. We also need to recognize that in this budget proposal, and this is a pretty significant shift, within about 5 years, NASA would have no operational role for human spaceflight vehicles whatsoever. Gateway would be canceled, SLS and Orion would be canceled, ISS would be canceled. That is a type of shift in US space policy that I'm not sure we've really had a really robust thought about for a while. It's quite new. And so I'm a genuine believer in the never waste a good crisis. And so if that is a trend, as I said, Congress gets to weigh in, we'll see where it all ends up. But if that's a trend, I would humbly submit to this community that we should think about a practical reality for a sustained lunar presence. In a world where there really is predominantly government revenue, and a world where NASA, I think, is going to need to be figuring out what it operationally is going to be responsible for in the future that might be different than what it has been responsible for in the past. Having NASA own and operate some of the core infrastructure, not all, but some of the critical pieces required for long-term permanent human presence, which would include, let's just say, a HAB and at least some of the energy. That, I think, would give us a pretty clear role for the agency, and it would still be, none of that's cheap, right? The main cost is actually just resupplying with people and cargo. But that, I think, is a policy that is within our grasp if we're able to accept that level of ambition rather than the maximalist approach where we have all manner of ISRU immediately, and we also commit a little bit more to the lunar surface than simply landing and seeing what happens.
Yeah, so I have so many themes that I pulled from those. It was a very delicious meal and got spicy. I think ending with something that is red planet related kind of gets some spice in there. I want to poke just briefly on what you said, and I think you very artfully set up two straw men and then drew a line that says between them. And we've talked a lot from this community about the big filter that it will be in getting there and operating. This is what Tim started with, and it actually was implied, I think, with what Alex got to at the end. So I think that that's something that we actually all kind of agree on, is that, we got to fly and do this, but that is, in doing that, we will discover what is the pragmatic and whose role that can be and how industry can support that. In the middle, the mid-course was, I took it as removing some of the artificial barriers between academia and commercial, and being able to understand what those are. And then what Tim number 2 was talking about was some of the artificial barriers between the different funding bodies. So I thought that was a really interesting playthrough. Really appreciate you all's perspectives there. We did not actually plan that out, but it was beautiful. Thank you. So one of the questions that we had kind of set you up for when we were planning some of this is, what do you see as some of the biggest disconnect from some of these lunar surface concepts and some of the capabilities that industry is ready to provide? And where is there a really good match? So anyone who wants to jump in on that, I'd be very happy to hear. And you can't just say Lunar Outpost or Lockheed Martin.
I mean, I guess I'll just start and say that I think survivability is to me a big issue. Pretty much everything that's gone to the moon has only planned to live for 2 weeks. So how do we make that how do we make that go multiple cycles? And I know people are working on it, but I also know that like a lot of missions, people are just not even planning beyond the sunlit portion. So, I would really like to see whether it's power supplies and heating or whatever the extreme environment, electronics, development to make it through more than one lunar cycle.
I bet the Tims have something to say about this.
Yeah. So I think this is a match.
Yeah.
We're in a great period where we have new technologies in earthbound small nuclear reactors that are under development, and we have new policies that were put in place in the first Trump administration to make it a little bit easier to be launching nuclear reactors. And so with the NASA Fission Surface Power procurement coming up, I think that is a great match for where industry is right now to be able to finally do space nuclear at an infrastructure scale. We're gonna need it to survive the night, but I don't think that's the biggest use case, because I think solar is part of that. I think it's the in situ resource utilization needs on the moon and on Mars that needs that scale of power. And also with FSP being intended to be start as a demo and then go operational, I think that's an excellent model. Tim, number 2.
No, I would agree. I think I just want to go off that. I think lunar night survival, sustained operations through sustainable power generation. Ultimately, I think that's going to be a huge issue for all the systems that we're talking about, and nuclear is part of that. Fuel cell technology is part of that. VSAT technology is part of that, and ultimately, it's going to be sort of a heterogeneous mix of all of them. And I think that's the biggest disconnect in terms of we just need to have available power on the moon to power all these things and make sure they survive for longer than 2 weeks, so that ultimately they can, become a commercialized service to other technologies that are going up there, other mobility systems. I think that's the biggest piece ultimately is how do we create the infrastructure to sustain all these things that we're talking about, and power is a huge point on that.
So I want to ask, you guys are hitting on things that need to happen, need to be improved. We are LSIC, right? Yeah. And so a question that's come through here, I think it's a really good question from each of you. Can you tell us how LSIC can actively support projects in securing funding and partnerships to move the discussion from a discussion to real implementation? What could we do as a community to support us in that?
Well, I'll take a crack at that, in part because I remember coming up with the budget line for LSIC originally. I remember it was in the Office of the Administrator at some point, and Tom Kremens, who was head of strategy at NASA and was my boss at the time, said, hey, we're getting some indication that we need to create some sort of lunar surface innovation thing. What do you think? What should we do with that? I was like, I don't know, put something, like 15 million into the STD budget, call it some sort of lunar surface innovation initiative. Good. And that was about all we saw for it for a while until it came out the other end. That was kind of a placeholder because it was meant to really be at that time, it was the only commitment that we were making as an agency to funding lunar surface activity at all, outside of landers, right? In fact, I believe we put that in there prior to the HLS commitment. Right? It was an early leader that the agency was serious about lunar surface activities. We're now a long way away from that, right? We now actually have multi-billion-dollar commitments to the HLS system. And one of the continual stresses and challenges that we've heard in the community is, well, okay, you've got this small amount of funding over here that's kind of ideating and supporting some early stage activities, but where is the commitment to be using some of these technologies? Where is that real demand signal for these things down the road? And that's not something STMD can solve, right? I mean, STMD, I didn't mention their particular life as proposed by the 26 FY budget, but it's a 50% reduction. So that becomes even less possible to see that STMD is the source that can really pull those technologies forward. And so what is really needed, and that's kind of where I'm talking about kind of really needing to be practical and really needing to be serious. Everything is going to cost real money. Everything serious on the lunar surface is going to cost, not single-digit millions. It's going to be in the hundreds of millions to potentially, for some items, billions. So you're going to need to have, in this context, it would be ESDMD, articulate more clearly what its permanent infrastructure is going to be. Now, that's a policy decision, right? They will not come to that decision by themselves until it is made clear to them that that is, in fact, the political expectation of this administration, and that is built into the budgets. But that's what we're going to need to see. It's going to need to be run from ESDMD. So in some respects, I would say one of the things that LSIC community can do is to recognize that it's not within STMD's power to solve these things, and that there needs to be collective advocacy for making sure that ESDMD actually has a demand for permanent lunar infrastructure.
And I certainly agree with that, but I'm going to add an and. And I am a human spaceflight guy. I had spent 10 years on Orion, and I really value the importance of that mission as core to NASA. But I do think that if we overemphasize the human part as opposed to the robotic part, that we might get ourselves a little stuck. And so having a focus on infrastructure to support robotic activity should be there as well. And I think one of the things that LSIC has done very well is create this community and brought a lot of the community together. But perhaps, as we were talking about, that we're breaking down barriers between funding sources. Maybe LSIC can help coordinate funding sources. And so that's bringing in the investor community, both venture capital and more old-fashioned. But I think it's also bringing in international government funding, international investment. There are space investors, and perhaps they should be here with us too, as well as which you are doing is sort of like, from a NASA perspective, what are the right places to put things?
Yeah, Tim kind of stole my thunder. I was going to talk exactly about that. Can I get a show of hands? Who is a venture investor, family office, private equity associate?
One hand.
Blair.
It would be great if half the room was raising their hands, right? I think engaging in the venture community, engaging with private capital, we got to hear what's important to them, like return on investment, ROI. They need to see a path to 3x, 10x their investments, depending on the maturity of what they're investing in. And ultimately, if LSIC could be, I talked a little bit about funding mechanisms and demand signal mechanisms. If LSIC could engage all of the stakeholders together, get them in a room, and we're having breakout sessions on what are those funding mechanisms, and the right people are in the room to define what those are, that's like an actionable step that they could take back to their internal folks and try to sell it, because they've had everyone around the table, all the voices, all the considerations, and ultimately it's a sort of a real product that they can take internally. But I think that's, to Tim's point, it's like we got to get more of those folks in the room that are part of these stakeholder groups that have a real seat at the table at this point.
I agree with that. We've talked about that before, about trying to really increase that sector.
I'll just say that I think one of the roles of LSIC has been sort of bringing the community together and fact-finding. But now that we are further along, I really think, why don't we write position papers? Why don't we do a decadal survey? I mean, we could do those kinds of things as a community and make recommendations, like this is how we think you should do it. So I think that would be great. Bring the stakeholders together and write a document together. Another thing that, at least on the academic side, I think is very low-hanging fruit is, we just had, I want to shout out to the Lunar Autonomy Challenge, and that just completed. That was awesome. And I would really like to see that be like a regular thing. Not necessarily autonomy, but like pick a topic every year and have this 3 or 4 year competition where universities can participate, and then you kind of winnow it down to a few finalists. And it's a different theme every year maybe, but why not do that? I think that'd be a great engagement at low cost.
Hello. I've been.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, I've been trying really hard not to talk, but
This is
y'all
Mickey's
done it
voice,
now.
by the way.
I gave you a mic beforehand.
I know,
We
that was
knew.
dangerous. So first of all, since Alex kindly brought the room down with reality there, I'm going to feed off of that and some of the questions we've heard here, and just having an open, transparent dialogue, right? So I will say, first of all, it's important to know the LSIC is one component of the task that we have for LSII. It's actually, with APL, it's actually, LSI, for those who don't know, is the Lunar Surface Innovation Initiative. From day one, we said we will have a consortium as part of that because we do not want to be in an echo chamber. So the task is actually what we call a system integration task, but it includes studies and tech gap assessments and all kinds of other stuff that your input goes into so that APL can give us a balanced kind of independent feedback. In addition to this, though, the NASA SMEs in each of those capability areas are partnered with the APL lead so that APL has insight into all that's going on with the NASA architecture planning, so they can really look across those and say, you're not pushing state of the art here far enough, or we think the government should be doing more of this stuff. And then we do try to take those tech gap assessments and that input and feed that back in to our stakeholders on the government side. That we have been trying to do that. I will be the first one to tell you it has not been as effective as I'd hoped in terms of how the products are used, and it is hard to get those to resonate. So we should talk more about how to do that effectively. I'll also say, talking about getting the venture capitalist here, I was real heartened. Let's see, we kicked off in 2020, right? 2019, 2020, and after about 2 years of going, so about two and a half years in, we did start seeing more venture capitalists coming, and some big names, some kind of non-traditional space, like serious players. And I had some really frank conversations with them and said, what led you here, and what are your thoughts? And they said, look, the feedback I got was the money is out there, the interest is out there. We're here because NASA has been signaling really strongly for the last couple years and pretty consistently, and Alex mentioned it, the budget was going up, right? And that was a strong signal, and they said, we've been on the outskirts watching for a long time. It's not been a money or an interest issue. It has been, y'all are fickle. It is hard to predict what you're gonna do, and it's kind of like the stock market. We send signals, that demand signal we talk about goes to inverse too, right? Mm-hmm. And so the reason, I just want y'all to know, like, they were starting to come, and that was a big breakthrough. The next year is when our budget went back down, and now we've got Blair. we've got Blair here, thank goodness. But we have tried to work to do that, and I just wanted to be transparent. And then the challenge thing I was going to mention, we do have other challenges as well, like Big Idea Challenge is probably the closest to what you said that we did for about a decade. Mm-hmm. But we also have the Luster, just to remind everybody, we got some Luster. Do we have any Luster students in the room? We had some. Yay, Luster. Yeah, the Lunar Surface Technology Readiness. So we kicked that off at the first LSIC. But we do have a lot more work to do on I think everything y'all are saying is really about, there's a lot more products as part of this LSII piece that are not necessarily being infused or messaged or used as effectively as they could be. So we need to work on that.
And I really appreciate your feedback saying working on position papers and data. One of the goals that we gave to our team this year is let's write a document in each focus area with the community, not inside. Because we said that. We said, people are at the point that we want to do this together. We want to do it together, not we get some from you and then we put it together. So that's one of our pushes actually for this year. So that's good to hear that something's actually wanted.
Absolutely. And, one of the things, in speaking about all of these challenges, there's still stuff that we really want to do. So I want to pull the thread a little bit on what Alex said about being practical and kind of find the point between that and what I think Tim was talking about, which is, the ISRU and nuclear driven, which in my mind that there's big dollar signs when you get to those levels. So maybe you could talk just a little bit about your perspectives on sequencing that infrastructure development so that we don't get stuck in some place, we're not overly ambitious, we can bite things off in the 5-6 year wedges that are appropriate. What do you think, what are your thoughts on how we actually sequence the infrastructure so we can be practical and still have a path to achieve what what we'd like to get to. And we can start either way. I'm going to ask everybody, tell me.
Yeah, so I think the fundamental beginnings, so we already talked about power. I think communications is very important. And then that communications is the whole link, right? It's not just the lunar relay, but what are the communication systems on Earth? And there are many commercial companies that do space communications, and they would like to expand to lunar, so that's great. I think the other part of it is mobility. We need right away. And then as far as the sequence, I think that we can let that evolve a little bit, right? Do missions on the surface of the moon, get going. What's the next demand signal for the infrastructure? Pay attention to what that nascent market is asking for and grow from there. And I think also, while keeping a focus on the long term of Moon and Mars and what do the big things need, and that'll drive the FSPs.
Yeah, I would take the approach that it's all in one. It has to happen all at the same time. We talk about systems like, yesterday we're talking about Mark 1, and it deploying the LAMPS, power infrastructure. And once that lands and has lunar night survival capabilities, it could be a comms node, it could be a power node, and that, that other heterogeneous systems can plug into. Like the LTV that we're developing can be used as a relay back to Earth for comms. It could also transfer power. And I think it's all in one. It all has to happen at the same time. They're already, iSpace is talking about orbital relays that they're putting into lunar orbit. And that will continue to happen. I'm sure they'll build out some sort of constellation. And I think it all needs to build upon itself and use these sort of initial pieces to do it all. So then you could have discrete systems that can come after and be dedicated.
So let me ask you this. You guys both talked about evolving and growing and building. Do we have the flexibility that we need for that kind of approach right now? Or what would help?
What do you mean by flexibility?
Right, so if we're going to have to field these, and you said we have to evolve it, so that means that we have to have a plan to go from, the first ones that are going to be operable later on. What is the first? You're going to land something, right? And then you want to be able to make a change. So that means, you're going to do this now. Are you saying everybody is just going to keep watching that, or is there some, larger plan for what you learn here to feed forward into the next thing that you do?
Are you getting at how
Organic
we go
or more
about
systematic?
building it? Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
I have an analogy which I think is relevant, which is the space station. Like, if you think about the way space station was built and the way it grew, like the first couple of modules were actually a fully self-sufficient space station. They were just smaller.
Right.
And then you added more specialized, like crew quarters and, science observatory and so on. And so I would think you would do something similar with like a lunar modules expansion, where you kind of start, and I think part of it is having a plan, so the whole thing is kind of envisioned from the beginning, but then taking advantage of the things you learn along the way so that you can kind of phase in new technology as you get it.
I mean, to build on that, I see my colleague Steve Clark in the audience there, and I'm recalling kind of the work that we did back in 2019 for, what we thought was going to be the Artemis Base Camp, right? The first time we really started designing it. And I still think that the implied sequence there is the right one. You mentioned let's not forget about the robotics, agreed. The robotics has like hundreds of millions of dollars in it. The humans have the billions of dollars. And so the first critical thing to get committed to is what we call the foundation surface hab. We need an actual national habitat that we will be living in. Once you have that commitment, that is the demand driver for everything else. And we had that at the plan, and we kind of frankly lost focus on it, right? The plan was to actually proceed with Foundation Surface Hab, and then administration changed. We kind of went into whole objectives-focused activity, and objectives are fun, they're very cheap. A Foundation Surface Hab is expensive. It's a real commitment. But if we can make that commitment, then you'll get the second part of the sequence, which was going to be power. Right? In fact, you need those pretty close, because you can have a power system, so you can have a hab that is mostly self-sufficient, but then you put the power, And then that, if you build it successfully, and I know there's people who are talking about doing power beaming from orbit, so there's different options, you know, in the trade there. But those are the two key pieces of infrastructure. But we really got to start with the commitment to HAB, because if you don't have that commitment, then you do not, in fact, have a commitment to a lunar surface permanent presence.
Yeah, it all goes back to demand signal, right? We need that strong demand signal to ultimately, you know, deploy these discrete systems. As you said, like if there's a foundational habitat platform, that'll be a huge demand signal for all the enabling technology that we need for it.
Exactly.
Do you really have to start with human, a commitment to human, or can you start with robotic surface exploration and then build your way to human?
Do you want billions of dollars going to the lunar surface, or do you want hundreds of millions of dollars going to the surface?
It opens up opportunity for robotic systems. Like the robotic systems are needed to build the infrastructure for human permanence. So if you get that funding, that huge demand signal, like what's going to enable the habitation platform to be assembled, serviced, you know, moved from place to place potentially? Robotic systems.
And I'll put it at a tactical level. If you make the push for a permanent human capability on the surface and you're unable to get it politically, then that's going to be the signal that this is not going to be a huge market.
And that's actually, it's funny, the next question I was going to ask, because we have it in here, is what is or should be LSIC's plan to engage VC and private equity? Because what Nikki was getting at is they saw the demand signal, and then it went away. So it's kind of getting at that, if we don't have that right now, how do you think we could go about pulling those people in? We would love more Blairs in the room, right? Not just one. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Alex, what you're pointing at is that what is the revenue source? And today, the revenue source is government spending, and therefore humans and billions of dollars is what's necessary. If we can get to a different revenue source, and Lockheed Martin's favorite is water and propellant, and bringing that propellant back to Earth orbit where there's a lot of a space economy, that's good. But we need to do the prospecting to see if that water is there and accessible. And I think that actually kind of calls back to the role of government. I have to say I'm more of a Star Trek guy than a Dune guy. But I think the role of government is to be that nugget of the center of everything, pushing things before there's a commercial market. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily have to be hugely expensive. You know, NASA does the first water prospecting mission, and we get real results, and venture capital and private investment is like, okay, that's enough data that I'll fund the next mission. And so being that center spark to get us over a tipping point is where I feel government roles is.
Should we debate that, or?
Yeah.
I mean, so I agree. I think I would point everyone to the demand drivers of the cislunar economy paper that we had Stippy do for NASA a number of years ago. And for the next 15, 20 years, those markets do not seem to be likely, right? And so we do have the benefit of being in an industry that gets to think quite long term, right? We think about truly far term futures, right? So I can agree with you on kind of where we up at that end point, right? We do want that world where those are the markets. But given the expected costs, the expected cost of the infrastructure required to get those resources. Also, let's remember, water really doesn't actually contribute new revenue sources. It's actually largely something you're selling to other parts of the ecosystem. So in terms of new revenue sources, it doesn't look like there are a lot, right? There's always speculation, maybe the DoD's there, but that's always kind of something that I frankly hear about a lot more than I see. And so I think if we're really serious, we have to become serious. We have to say, yeah, NASA's going to be the revenue source for this. And how are we going to be driving these demand commitments? And I think without a commitment to a permanent lunar presence with humans, I don't think you get any of the other things. I think it becomes so much smaller, and then it's even harder to close the business case. I'll even go a little one step farther and say, I actually think you need even the power systems to be owned by the government for a very particular reason, which is that when we do the ISS National Lab, we give away $400 million worth of already paid for assets to commercial companies for free, provided they're doing research or they're doing something of value to the nation, right? Because we already have an ISS, and so we don't need to then charge the companies for the use of that resource. Power could be very similar. to help close the business cases of ISRU companies, it would be very beneficial if you could say, hey, there's already this available power that NASA has, and if you need to plug into it, don't worry about it. Just tell me what your research is, just like the ISS National Lab, and we're happy to provide you some free power. That is a very huge enabler to commercial activities. So I think we need to kind of have those conversations about what is the real total level of demand that we can expect for the next 10, 15 years, and then what does that mean in terms of a sustainable model that NASA can fund?
Yeah, I think we're agreeing. It's just about the timeline. You're saying, and yes, this is what I think. The short term, I'm hoping 10 instead of 15, but the short term is dominated by that government spark. But tipping points happen fast, and so yes, we should do that. And if we hit a tipping point, then commercial will take over pretty quickly.
Yeah, and that would be great, right? And so it's kind of like, how would this fail, right? Like, what are the ways in which this would fail? And I think if you don't have that government commitment and at least some public ownership of the infrastructure to make sure that people will continue to have their tax dollars appropriated for its support, I think that's pretty important. Because we're getting a potentially concerning signal, right? 25% budget cut. It could go lower, right? So what is required to sustain the national commitment to a lunar surface set of infrastructure? And the first, and in NASA's national. And it's important, I think, for at least part of it to be US flagged and to be carrying the American flag, because I think that's what people like funding, frankly.
I'll just say that you have to put the moon in context of our journey to Mars, and there's a lot of case to be made that we can't get to Mars without going to the moon first. And I mean, it is our testing ground. It's so much more accessible. I mean, it is a long way away, but it's a lot closer than Mars, right? Yeah. So I think when you put it in that framework, if we have an ideological commitment to go to Mars, then the moon is part of that. And if you can just get to a certain sustainability, then you get the economic drivers. So
I wanted to pull back just into something that I think is often a nuanced point, but we need to hammer in on a little bit. Nikki's always talking about the miracle happens here. I think about it as like the great filter that has stopped us so many times in trying to accomplish these things. And I think some of it is the barrier between what Glenn was talking about in the robotic and what Alex was talking about in the human. And I think that's something that we're often is missed in this discussion, is that one leads to the other, and the novel technologies of today need to become the foundational technologies that enable that human presence as well. So this also gets at one of those artificial barriers of, we want to do human stuff, we want it to go to humans, who's owning all of this stuff? And I think that one area where we owe ourselves some more attention is a deliberate, intentional approach that interleaves those, right? So I want to maybe hear about how maybe Glenn and Alex can meet in the middle on this process, and not just say it's humans or not to say it's robots. It's going to be a progression. I don't think we're going to start with humans, for sure, 50 humans continuously. So talk maybe just a little bit about how you can make that message so that it is harmonious. We have a time here, we're together, let's make it so that it works.
I mean, I would just say that, if we had a decadal survey for, lunar exploration, that you could have all that in there. You could have the end state is the human occupation, permanent presence on the moon, and then you have the stepping stones to get there. So you're very clear that this is our goal, but we can't just wake up and have a permanent base on the moon. We have to build it over time.
With no barriers between the robotics and humans.
Yeah.
One.
Yeah. Exactly.
Strategy.
It's an enabling push, basically.
Yeah, I mean, we have an HLS program. We've got 2 HLS providers who've been selected. If they're able to land, at least one of those can probably be turned into a HAB. And so I don't think that part is as hard. That's why I'm talking about the commitment here. Each of those capabilities requires very significant budgetary commitments to be planned for. So yeah, it's not either or, right? That's been a false dichotomy for a long time. But again, I track the dollars. And so are you spending billions or are you spending hundreds of millions? And I think, if we want more venture capitalists in the room, we want more, private family offices, we better be planning to spend billions on the lunar surface Otherwise, it will not be developed. You'll have, some small CLPS landers in the future, and that will be what the American space program is. That's not what we want, right? And so I think we have to scope it at a sustainable level. And the ISS is really the best example we have of this. We have companies that have innovated on new launch vehicles because we had a permanent demand need for the delivery of cargo and crew, because we had a national, commitment to an international facility that justified the continued investment in those capabilities to allow them to evolve over time. Same model can work for the moon.
Yeah, I think we're talking about use cases here, right? And I totally agree with Alex. I think we can all see ourselves, in an astronaut that's stepping foot on the moon or is on the ISS. Like, there's a clear psychological through line to, that's not that far away. If there's all this robotic activity with no humans on the moon, like, okay, cool. But like, there's not like a national pride movement. There's just not a mental connection, from a humanity perspective. It's almost like, what's the point, right? It's in the name of profit, that's great. But ultimately, if it's in the name of exploration and pushing the bounds of humanity, that gets people excited. And I think we're talking about robotic systems and humans working together. Ultimately, these robotic systems need to be designed for humans, but have applicability to all of these commercial applications. And I think, I keep harping on LTV, it's just close to our heart, but LTV is a system that is designed for the Artemis astronauts to explore and to close their scientific objectives. It is a mobile laboratory, scientific laboratory, but it is also an infrastructure enabling vehicle. It is a large logistics mobility vehicle that can tow a fission surface power unit to where it needs to go. It can tow habitation models where they need to go. It can deploy power infrastructure. It can test all of these commercial technologies. And that's just like, we designed it to run autonomously when it's not being utilized by crew.
Yeah, and I think the LTV is a really nice example because we knew Lunar Outpost before you were LTV award, and like the early steps that you did to get your footing and like have a couple missions and really get this stuff going, and how that can lead to those connections there. Like, companies definitely do not see these boundaries at all. Right?
Yeah, and Wes, your question's a difficult one, which is to how do we find a place in the middle? Yeah. And on ISS, we committed very early to, as soon as possible, have continuous presence on the ISS. And Alex, to your point, that was a huge demand signal, continuous presence. So, and we developed whole new rocket systems. If we're in a situation where we don't want to commit to continuous lunar presence right away, perhaps that's the middle ground. And that is actually the current Artemis program, right? Is that they're going to spend about a week a year on the surface, and that is less than continuous presence, but it is the human spaceflight presence, and it has certain infrastructure needs. And then from a robotic perspective, including LTV and other things, that they're there 365 days a year with infrastructure built for humans. And so maybe that's the middle ground.
Yeah, well, and I thought we were still looking to see kind of a 30-day stay as the target goal, because that was kind of planned for essentially a kind of hypothetical first Mars mission. So you're looking to get that kind of 30-day stay. So then your question is, can you afford one or two 30-day stays in some infrastructure? And I think if you got to, say, 2 30-day stays per year, unclear whether that's there, but you're getting to a very significant demand signal already. And so I think that's the kind of level to be ambitiously shooting for. Yeah. That is not permanent presence, because I agree, it's a bit of a different beast than it was in Leo.
And we talked a lot about ISS as the demand signal, but it also is it's a phenomenal symbol, right? So it's ISS. We all understand this. You can look it up. You can take pictures of it transiting the moon. It is a symbol that traverses all countries' borders, and that's a very powerful thing too. I'm curious if there's a thought that you could put to what we could do to coordinate to get better at what that symbol could be as we're projecting further on. So we're sending, one of the questions in the chat, for instance, is what are we doing when we're sending all these landings just to different locations? Are there simple things where we can pick a place and start building out in that way, and that can become the symbol? And maybe it starts also with the demand of like, it has to be this long for this many time, and that's the demand signal, as well as the symbol, which will also kind of work together to get that demand. Maybe you all can speak of that.
Personally, I always like the, kind of model where you land in a few places, right? So you kind of do some site observation, but you basically, commit to somewhere. You plan to commit to somewhere within a few landings, right? So there's a little bit of site exploration. You've got eyes on the ground. You got people who can talk about the different sites. They can even, you made a really good point about that kind of psychological through line for people. It matters, right? And so having people who say, hey, I went to this site and this is what we saw, and we did these analyses, and we think we could put the power here, and have that for a few places, but have the infrastructure which is the same, right? You're going to need basically the same HAB capability. You're going to need basically the same power capabilities, and so then you can say, great, a selection has been made. It's going to go here. And then you proceed. You make the best decision you can with the information you have at the time. And, I would be delighted in a future where in 35 years, a bunch of people are like, man, we chose wrong. We ended up with the wrong permanent moon base because that's what this community loves to do. And that would be great. I would love to see that conversation happen.
I love the Civ game, so I think of when I look at the moon, these potential landing sites are the ones that have the little gold city icon on them. And yeah, we might not pick the right one, but you can pick one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of International Space Station, I would like to say, I think one of the biggest impacts of it is not technological, it's diplomatic. And, the role of all the nations participating. And the moon is already, it's going to be a global, community at the moon. We already have all these international players and companies. And so I would say, rather than walk away from that, I would say embrace that. Like, how can we use our human program to the moon to really engage with our international partners and, come up with a multinational solution?
And I know the commercial providers like that too, because that's part of their market that they can serve. There's other agencies that want to participate and spend money as well. Tim, the Tims both went to the mic, so go ahead.
No, I just had a point on Alex's, I think it's an interesting thought, 35 years in the future, we chose the wrong place, right? We have to do it all again and create all this infrastructure, make the infrastructure mobile, right? Especially at first. It's, we talk about the multipurpose HAB that OSCE is developing with Thales. We could potentially deploy that in a place that's maybe not so interesting. I think pretty quickly we'll know if the area that we've chosen is an area of interest for additional commercial activity and human exploration. Just make those initial pieces or Artemis elements mobile so that you could potentially move them to another place if you find one on a different exploration mission that is, okay, that's where we need to build for the next 100 years, right? Make it interoperable.
And Wes, you asked about, what's a symbol, and I think today, for me, a very enduring symbol that I'd like folks to be more aware of is, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter is imaging the Apollo sites, and the footsteps are still there, right? And in the end, it's the artifacts of our activity, and the rover tracks are still there, and the experiments left behind are still there, and we can still hit them with the laser reflectors. So I think it's that activity that's visible to people on the Earth, with some help, that is that symbol. And then I do agree with, with the mobile phase of infrastructure, the permanent phase of infrastructure. I think the other thing is we think long term, though, is that there are many, many scientific sites on the moon that really benefit from scientist astronauts being there and performing the science. And I want to get to that future where we can support those sortie missions, because that'll be an indication of our ability to operate on the moon. And then I think from a commercial perspective, if we're engaged in the entire surface, then that means the entire surface is open for activity and perhaps resource.
Y'all know me, I want to go a little rogue. Let's go rogue. We don't have mics set up, but we want to hear from you guys. Is there anyone in the room that actually wants to ask a question or a comment?
Or tell us a question that you want to
Okay,
answer.
hold on, we'll get you a mic.
All right, we got it.
Well, while we're doing that,
Oh,
can
and
I just...
Nikki, while we're doing it,
Yeah,
Nikki
I
can,
want to just set one thing. So I just want to observe, and I'd be curious to know if others are feeling the same thing, because I could be in my own little bubble, and the whole point of this is to not be in an echo chamber, right? But from my observations and my experience over the last 5 years and working with, across NASA, across industry and academia and all these areas and the feedback we've continually gotten, remembering that this forum was created because there were no forums anywhere that focused on getting the technologies developed that you need to do science or exploration. So I just want to reset for a moment and say, from my observation here, the microcosm of what I just saw us do here today, right this moment, and the shifting from the panel we just did to this panel and the debate is the microcosm of what happens continuously in the macrocosm. And what I mean by that is, it goes back to that accountability thing. So we immediately get into, should we have a permanent hab? Should we do robotic missions? All those things, right? We just talked in the last panel, what drives the budget, I think a lot in these marks are things like the geopolitical climate. We have countries that are very actively going to the moon. Things like international partner agreements. We just talked about having 55 countries that have signed the Artemis Accords. I totally agree with what Alex is saying, but I do think those things can shift when different things come to light like this, different factors. The big elephant in the room I want to say is this whole robotic or versus human, and yeah, we have to do some minimum amount. That is the miracle occurs here that we're not still giving credit to, that takes time, money, budget, time, but money and budget, same thing. It takes a lot, it takes both. And so I just want to say, like, all these things you're talking about, living in the habs, operating in the habs, you have to still survive the environment. You have to have life support systems. You have to mitigate the dust. You're gonna, I'm assuming, be exploring and going around places and doing stuff. So in order to make that reality and make it safe for any humans, all those little technologies that we're all assuming are just there when we have this picture in our head are not funded right now. They are not planned. They are not on the books. So I want to be a voice before we turn the microphones over. I'm channeling the companies that I've been working with for the last 5 years. And I'm going back to the accountability. We awarded $250 million, I think, don't quote me, of tipping points in 2022. 110 million of that came from industry IRAD. They are not contractors, they are partners. They have put skin in the game because of the plan we said we're doing. We talk about venture capitalists. Hell, how about the companies right here on the room and online that have, their companies are on the line, their livelihoods are on the line, and they have the goods. We just have to do our next part that we show in all of our blueprint objectives and plans. So I'm guilty of the same exact thing we're doing here, but this is where I think the impression of us being fickle comes from, is it is kind of an academic luxury to debate if it's robotic or HABs. Where we are today, we have got to take some accountability and say we are working with industry, because the third leg of STMD's core tenets is to create a commercial industry base that we're responsible for nurturing and fostering that for a commercial ecosystem. And I don't see us talking about that thread. So I would love to hear from the companies in the room that have been making these investments, small companies, large companies, anybody online, but I would love to hear your voice, your voices.
Well, here's one. So Dallas Beanhoff from Offworld. We are putting money on the line for ISRU stuff. But Alex, I like your comment about free power to users of the government thing. That should also be extended perhaps to habitat, free stay, or LTVs, free mobility, et cetera. But the question that I asked at the last panel that somehow disappeared, I don't know if it was wiped off or if it was questioned, but what about the U.S.? Has the U.S. considered joining the ILRS as the first step in collaborating with our competitors so that they may join the Artemis Accords? We see them as another customer. You know, Artemis Accords customer, ILRS is a customer. But what about that? I know this is not necessarily the right panel for that, but Michael was here and he would have been the right answer. But Alex, you may have some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for that generous question, Dallas. You know, it's tough, actually. It was kind of funny. You know, the Star Trek Dune reference was made earlier, right? And I think you're coming from a Star Trek perspective on that, right? And I can salute it, right? I loved it. I love TNG. It's great. I don't think we're in that reality right now. Might wish we were, but when I look at the world, I objectively don't see that. In fact, I see a driver of significant lunar expenditures coming from very much the opposite. And so I think, whenever I was at NASA, I would always try to kind of say, I think we need to remember some of the ideals that get us into space in the first place, right? We do want a future where we are cooperating internationally with the world. And at the same time, that is not the world that we're living in right now, right? For arguably, good reasons, right? And so I think we need to kind of say, okay, there might be at least a phase where we're developing maybe 2 different lunar research stations, right? And I guess where I'm trying to get us to here is let's at least commit to building a lunar research station. Because until we do that, we're not having that serious conversation, right? And if we end up in a world where there's a couple, I'm not sure I've talked about this publicly before, but I'm not at NASA anymore, so they can't fire me. But you can think about a kind of lunar NASA equilibrium, which is what we ended up in LEO, right? At the end of the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States looked at their expenditures and said, I'm not sure we can afford to maintain 2 different, space station freedom and a Soviet capability. There are a lot of other politics involved. But the 2 parties, which had been conflictual for decades, figured out a way to work together, right? But they both had equities. They both had hardware. They both had commitments to permanent LEO presence. And so if someone liked the future you were talking about, I would say at this point the only way for us to even get there is to have our own commitment to a independent lunar research station that is US operated with international partners. And if we are so fortunate that we can enter a future where we can cooperate with others, that would be wonderful. But I wouldn't bet on it right now.
Got more in the audience, too.
Eric Stroll here from Amphenol Aerospace. I think we all remember the Anasari X Prize and what that brought about, but just talking about funding mechanisms, and I guess my question is there a place for the kind of the prize model for private companies to use to solicit work, and why don't we see more of that?
Yeah, I think those kinds of other alternative funding mechanisms can be really significant. I mean, you need to have a visionary. You need to have someone who's willing to back it financially. But it'd be great if we could do that. I think the question is how do we create an environment where those kinds of prize ventures are available? And I think part of that is, again, making the case, creating the vision so that philanthropists want to get involved. And I feel like maybe we just have more to do there to really pitch it. But why not? Sure. I mean, I think one thing we have to do is kind of wean ourselves away from total dependence on the government for all of the demand signal that we're asking for. So any way we can do it is good.
Oh, hi. My name is AJ Katari. I'm from President of Astrox Corporation. I very much like and agree with Alex's idea of if we really want to have a cislunar economy, we have to have a lot of exciting things that can happen, and human presence and human permanent presence, but not permanent in the sense of same people staying there for a long time, but rotating from time to time. That idea is necessary to be conveyed. I mean, the elephant in the room right now is that we need to go and together, 4 of you together, and LSIC, to go and talk to President Trump that we need to have this particular type of thing. If you can find $75 billion for Golden Dome, certainly we need billions of dollars for this, and we should be able to convince OSTP or President Trump to, I really urge you people at the dais right now to see, and others, to see if we can together make a strong case for permanent human presence, which then can lead to a lot more in terms of cislunar economy. Thank you.
We'll take one more. The beautiful Karen.
Hi, I'm Scott Johnson from Spacely Packets. Feedback was requested from small businesses. I'm probably the smallest one here. I'm a mom and pop. Comms was held up as one of the most important initial components. The model of the ISS was put forward as an example, a shining example of international success through cooperation. With 25 years of experience in internetworking, I can say that that same model is what has allowed the internet to grow across the world and reach every corner of our planet and our civilization. The multi-stakeholder nature of that is key to how it has grown. So, as a small businessman, I've been all in on this for 3 or 4 years now. Myself and my associates at the Interplanetary Networking Special Interest Group have, over the past 20 plus years, built all the components necessary for a robust communications infrastructure that can both provide that international multi-stakeholder model such that many different nations and or private companies can provide relay services, provide surface level network services. And it can be done in a manner with perfect forward secrecy, so it doesn't matter whose network we're passing through, our information and their information is going to remain safe. I'd like to hear your opinions on a multi-stakeholder governance model for interplanetary communications.
Well, we already have the LunaNet model. I think that that's probably the starting point. I feel like what is nice there is that it's an opt-in model, that it's just a set of standards. If you conform to these standards, you're compatible with anybody else who conforms to those standards. So, it's really intended for lunar system, but maybe you could have a solar system version of that.
And I'll just note that the ITU has put onto its agenda a discussion of the use of lunar spectrum amongst the international parties. And so there is movement to that. And it's interesting because I agree the ISS is a particular shining example of international cooperation, but it's one type of international cooperation, right? There's other models you can think about. People have talked about the authority model. Could you set up an international lunar development authority? But the challenge with that stuff then becomes, well, how do you get, if you're putting in a country's assets, how do you make sure that, you get your return as the country that's funding it? So I do think we're in an interesting moment to be having those dialogues, and I actually frankly think if there are grad students who are interested in kind of political economic arrangements, it's a really good one to study.
Okay, I think we're a little over actually, are we? Oh, sorry, you guys had such good stuff. We had to keep talking. There's a lot of questions we couldn't get to, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to discuss these with Nikki and make sure all this feedback is given to NASA. But what I want to say in closing this is, please bring this energy all the time. Like, all our meetings are good, don't get me wrong, but man, I feel like this meeting has been so good. The breakout rooms, the panels, there's been so much interaction. We've got breakout rooms after this that are getting at a lot of the topics that we've talked about up here. I don't want this to be the only forum that we can do this in. You can contact us at any time. I mean, we've got our emails up on our website. We want to do better, and we want to do the little piece of the pie that we, as LSI and LSIC, can do to give you what you need to push all this forward. And what I have heard as the LSIC director more than anything is, you want me to give you more work? Y'all want to write papers for free? This sounds great. That's something I've heard, and we're definitely going to push forward on that. Do you have anything before I talk about food trucks?
I know Nikki wanted, I think, to say one last thing before we're finishing.
want
Did you have
something,
something,
Nikki?
Mike? Do you have something?
Yeah, just one quick clarification. It's a good prompt for food for thought as you go off and network and talk these things. So when we start talking about the power utility thing, the government providing that is exactly what I've been talking about in the LIFT framework that we're saying, or what are the things, again, the government should do that aren't yet profitable for industry or that common needs. And I've said this about space station forever. You could make a business out of the, rack size kind of hang your tile, but someone's got to cover the utilities and the infrastructure of the thing itself. And so that's a lot of what this Lift One framework does. But I do want to mention, as much as we jumped on that in terms from a space tech job jar, I'm just going to whine, from my existence and for many of the companies I'm trying to speak for, both of those sides of the coin are in our job jar right now in space tech. In other words, paying for and providing and developing that infrastructure, that plug and play that you come into, a lot of that falls on us. Also, though, if industry wants to come do ISRU, now that we've done that, or test a power system, we are partnering with them to do that. I would love to hear from industry if you're saying that industry has the funding to go develop the system if we have the interface, because I don't think that's true. They're still counting on that, a big portion of that funding to flow through the government out to them. So it goes back to that government demand signal. So just want to plant that here for discussion as we go through the day.
Thank you, Nikki. Oh, we want to thank our panelists. They sat in these hot seats with their hot takes.